Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffin Talk Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And this is the third attempt at a video podcast, and it is so far so good. So for those of you who join us every week, you'll notice the audio is substantially better this week. The video is substantially better. Everything's good. Very happy, and that means that I can welcome our next guest, David Auge, to the show. Hi, David. How's it going?
Great. Nice to meet you, Mike.
Awesome. And you're in the field of environmental management, and you're on a mission to transform the humanities approach to looking at sustainability issues. You speak at environmental and business conferences, and you've invested numerous hours of practice and research into the areas of how to best communicate sustainability. You're also a certified sustainable development professional, energy manager, and hazardous material manager. You're also a registered professional engineer and LEED-Accredited Professional. I understand some of that, not all of that. We'll get into it. But what I do love is sustainability. I'm from Berkeley, California, so I'm all about the ecosystem and doing what we can. So I'd actually love to start with our traditional question and then jump into the subject. But how old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
Okay. Well, I'm 63. See, I grew up in Denver, Colorado. So that opportunity allowed me to be in and out of the mountains a lot. I actually trace most of my roots back to Aspen and Breckenridge. So it's in those two areas. And let's see, I'd have to be in the baby boomer generation. And that's where you'd most likely put me.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And I've been to Denver a few times in Colorado. It's definitely one of the, if not the most beautiful park and recreation states here in America. I'm in Arizona, so we're kind of in that boat. But I wanted to ask you a very specific question because I have been increasingly irritated throughout my lifetime with the misdirection of the conversation about the environment. So when I was a child, we just talked about the environment. We said, like, don't pollute, save water, sustainability. These terms were simple. Then the creepy, like, nefarious term global warming came in, and then it was, if it's warmer, why is it colder? And, all this distracting. So then they changed the term to climate change. And now it's okay, but there's scientists who get paid to lie about climate change. I'm actually on board with the scientists get paid to lie about things. I don't mind that argument. What I do mind is all of this is ignoring what I think is the most prominent issue, which is our environment is important. It's obviously polluted beyond any normal level. It's obviously a man-made cause pollution, and we can't eat fish out of most of the rivers in my country, United States of America. So that's kind of where I want to start this conversation is how do you deal with what I call the distracting conversation of climate change when really you're concentrating on sustainability? I'm assuming that happens to you.
It does. Usually, in my particular role, I find myself trying to come up with a conversation so you put sustainability into a perspective that can be discussed intelligently as opposed to emotionally. And that's usually where what you're talking about tends to breed. It breeds an emotional response that shuts down the possibility of a further discussion, like you mentioned, the humanities, where we can put a larger box around exactly what we're talking about and what we want to sustain.
And so how do you define sustainability? Like, what's your quickest, and it's okay if it's a longer definition, but.
Sure. That's a good question. Sustainability, it's a normative term. A normative term is a term that describes something else, like beautiful. It's either more or less beautiful, more or less sustainable. What we've done in many times, in many ways, is we've created confusion by changing the normative term into more of a exact prescriptive term. That creates frustration in many people's eyes about what is sustainable, why be sustainable. The approach that I'm trying to bring to the table, though, is to get that opened up, to get the concept of sustainability back into its normative understanding so that we can get back to a grasping of the issue on a spectrum, if you would, of understanding. And that's what I'm attempting to do by telling stories and bringing to the table two communities, insect communities, that we can analyze from a perspective that hopefully ratchets down some of the emotionalism that this issue usually prompts.
I love it. I absolutely love that because while I'm human and I'm emotional like anyone else, I am emotional about environmentalism as I refer to just this overall arching topic, but I'm totally aware of like superlative language, normatives, and like what you're describing. And I do agree that there's like just something off with in my lifetime a lack of respect for like what your goal is and what our all shared goal should be. I think my question to kind of keep things at a much larger level, because I want to get more nuanced, especially into insects. I really am excited to ask you about that. But
Right.
a lot of the other emotional arguments, but also I kind of validate this argument is it's not like America can just stop polluting and be sustainable, and then the rest of the world can keep doing whatever it wants to. Like the world is a world, but we still have nationalism, and even international contracts don't really work. There's tons of international law is just at best a work in progress. I'll be very nice and call it that. So how do you address that? Like, who are you trying to reach? Like the heads of states of every country? Like, how do you see this working out?
Well, you're trying to reach a younger generation, and I think I begin my book with that understanding. Is the fact that you have to figure out what are you going to sustain. Many times it comes down to raw materials, and I think that's where, if you've had a chance to look at my book, I try and bring that to the surface. In that you can turn this into merely a grasping after that aspect of sustainability, where we miss a larger picture. Have you heard of mimesis and poiesis? They're philosophical terms that have to deal with the way we observe what's around us. Let me give you
Only
some
the
background.
first one, not the second one.
Okay. The terms refer to two different ways of thinking about the world. A mimetic view regards the world as having a given order and a given meaning, and thus sees human beings as required to discover that meaning and then conform themselves to it. Poiesis, by way of contrast, sees the world as just so much raw material out of which meaning and purpose can be created by the individual. The poetic effort, the poiesis portion of that contrast, is where most of us in the West have gone. So it's merely a gathering, a measuring, a putting our arms around the raw materials, missing the aspect that hopefully my looking at bees and looking at honey and looking at locusts can bring to the surface. We need to look at it from what's already out there that is sustainable, so that we can perhaps get this argument from being an argument to something where we can learn from it.
Awesome. And I'm a novelist, so I'm not a nonfiction writer like you are. By the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the interview. There, we have a notes section on the podcast, and there will be a direct link to buy your book and everything. So,
Great, thank you.
Please, for everyone listening, I would just like to say that orally in case someone's listening. But as a novelist, my second novel I ever wrote in 2011 was about all the bees in the world dying, and then what happens after that. Mm-hmm. I was not joking, but I also wasn't really like super serious about it. I had just like heard it, and then I kept having dreams about this happening. Then later I started hearing like scary things about like bee populations declining, whether it's cell phone towers and all these theories and stuff. So my first question to you directly about the insect world is the bee population declining internationally still, and is that a problem?
Well, colony collapse disorder, which you're bringing to the table, where that kind of came to the surface in the political arena about 2005, 2006, where there was a 30 to 60% mortality of many of the hives being managed, and you're having written a book about this, by a lot of the larger operations in California as they moved across the United States. The population, at least in this past year, I received a notice from North Carolina State University, is on the rise again. Now, that was strange because I have 6 hives at work where I work, and I have 2 at home. And of the 6 at work, we're only having 2 that are so far made it through the winter. So, at least in my own estimation, this wasn't good. But the total population, which this apiary science group keeps track of, was showing success in the past couple of years.
So, what is the worst case scenario? What's the doomsday message, just for, because I do have younger people who listen, and I think a lot of people do care about this. What are the stakes if we were to just ignore declining insect populations and things like that? Like, does it start with that as a disaster, or is it more that if we kill off larger animals, it would affect them or vegetation?
Well, I kind of included in the book the fact that the bee population and our emphasis on Apis mellifera, which is the honeybee that we imported from Europe into the United States, if that actually decreased and allowed natural pollinators to gain a foothold again, there might actually be a benefit. There's a ratio. I can't remember the professor's name from Canada that showed about a 70% um, of a of an area that needed to be pollinated by bees. If you reduced it to about 70 to 60% and allowed the remainder of that territory to be occupied by native pollinators, that you would actually get a better yield in total. What we do
Forgive
is,
my. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, our efforts to maximize the amount of output and minimize the amount of inputs kind of uh, shriek at that foul, you know, allowing a certain portion of the ground to remain um, unused during a year. But it's about a 30% um, effort that this professor in Canada was bringing to the table. An idea, though, is the fact that we can depend so much upon this one insect to the detriment of more effective pollinators that are actually out there. So
And
it may not be as bad. Go ahead.
that's actually amazing, but I feel really dumb asking this, but I actually assumed that bees were the only pollinators. What other insects pollinate?
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Well, you've got just the Apis mellifera, which is the honeybee, but there are a number of
I
other
understand.
bees that are out there as
Oh, okay,
well.
okay. All right,
Yeah,
got it. Okay.
and one of the highlights is the fact that they can learn from each other. There's a number of points that I bring out in the book, and the fact that the Apis mellifera, that particular bee within the almond groves of California, will pollinate well the very tops of the trees, but not the lower portion of the trees. And many times they'll go straight as opposed to back and forth, allowing a better and more complete pollination effort. Where there are different bees that are out there that have a performance that will enhance the two. So if you put both of them into the grove at the same time, you'll actually get a better and a more effective pollination. But that's all apiary science and some of the things that are being brought to the table.
That's very cool. Which came first, your love of the environment or your love of insects and specifically bees?
Well, as a child, my mother always thought I was going to be an entomologist, so I found myself in that regard. But I went to school to become an engineer, so that's where this particular occupation that I hold came from.
And what kind of engineering degree did you get?
I got a civil engineer and then a master's degree in environmental engineering.
Got it. Okay. And what is environmental engineering? Is that like, I want to ask it in a way that's funny, but I'm not trying to be degrading. Is that like a hippie engineering, or is it the opposite of that? Because it sounds like it could go either way.
Yeah, yeah. I not at the graduate level. You're doing a lot of science. You're spending your time going through either atmospheric chemistry, wastewater operations, different control devices that are out there. So you're becoming an expert, if you would, on the pieces of equipment out there that will reduce air pollutants or wastewater pollutants or handle hazardous waste.
Awesome. So a little bit shifting away from the insect world, just because I have so many questions about this. I should let you know that I'm a book indexer is one of my careers, and so I get books that I'm paid to index, and one of them was recently the Oxford Encyclopedia of Water Management. So I did
Okay.
a 2,500 page encyclopedia, and a huge part of it was sustainability, and that's part of where I'm coming at this conversation from. What even before I did that project, what has always irritated me, and again, this is like an environmental engineering question, but not so much a an insect question. Why do we use drinkable water in toilets? Why don't we have like dual water systems in homes? Why aren't we reusing what's called gray water or
Mhm.
repurposing water for our gardens? Like what? How dumb is that? Or am I just being emotional?
No, no, you're talking about many of the things that are brought to the table through LEEDs, leadership in environmental and energy design. Most of those things, taking gray water, trying to repurpose water using, rainwater for irrigation and what have you, are on the table and actually are recognized for new construction for that very purpose, so that you start to put these into play, and the overall cost of its installation drops because you've done it so much more extensively than just mentioning it. So those are things that are recognized by the new construction standards that are out there, but you have to go the extra mile to implement them.
So, like in a country like India, where in a recent presidential election, and by recent I mean like a decade ago, the winner promised basically like potable water, like some sort of water in the average home. Are they considering these kind of projects, or are they just going to build like what America and other air quotes first world countries were traditionally using?
I really can't say what India is going to do with that. I know that if they have to comply with LEED standards or green or what's called um, green globes, these are construction standards placed on architects for for the projects they put into place. They will then have to meet those standards. But that usually doesn't happen at the lower level or the lower economic level. It usually happens at a large building operation, office buildings, and whatnot.
That makes sense. And again, I'm asking like exploratory questions because I'm dying to know if there's any sort of cohesion globally, if there's any like real uh, energetic effort for people to come together, either as companies or corporations. Because what I fear, and this is my next question for you, is like, what are the stakes in your opinion? Like Thomas Malthus famously mispredicted like what was going to happen with the food population, and every time
Right.
someone keeps predicting, we just keep having this. Oh, you're Thomas Malthus and you're wrong. Where do you stand on that kind of line, and where are we now with this current debate?
Well, there's a number of paradoxes out there. I mean, you're probably talking about the invisible hand paradox, and most people say that seems to haunt efforts. For example, the fact that if we increase the amount of miles that a vehicle can travel on a gallon, we're going to somehow save a great deal of air pollution going into the atmosphere. Well, the unseen consequence of that is we all drive more miles because it's now cheaper to do so. So there are invisible hands at work in that situation that somewhat frustrate anyone's efforts to try and put something like that on the table. Um, I guess that's what I'd have to say. The other one, of course, is um, there's two particular approaches, or I don't want to call them approaches, but paradoxes. One is the paradox of the invisible hand. The other one's the paradox of the commons, which most people fear. It's the a belief that you have a shared pasture where everyone is free to graze their cattle. It sounds ideal, but here's a catch: if everyone acts self-interested, then the pasture gets overgrazed, eventually destroyed. Individuals acting independently, according to their self-interest, they deplete that shared resource, and that's where the two paradoxes, the paradox of the commons and the paradox of the invisible hand, continue to find themselves butting heads in the very concept of what you're trying to do. Is it the commons? Is it our self interest is going to result in the consumption of all the resources? Or is the invisible hand going to have some aspect of a reward from a resource coming out that's now being beneficially reused somewhere else? That's not a good answer, Mike, but I mean, that's about what
Well,
I'd say.
if you had a good answer, you'd be like lead emperor of the world. So it's kind of. I'm not expecting a miracle here. I am. You're
Yeah.
clearly an expert. You're very intelligent, and you're also articulate, which is the third and often missing link with academics who want to speak to regular folks. So
Mhm.
I always appreciate an author who has the scientific background because it really is a skill. Like Richard Feynman was a brilliant example of that. He was able to like articulate very weighty concepts for an average layperson. And kind of on that subject, I uh, I do want you to speak to like um, the overall like goals of food production in your eyes. So I'm not asking what is popular and what other scientists say, but like, do you feel like we can support a growing population with a mix of animals and vegetation? Do you think we should be switching to more factory farming or less? Like what? Because I hear very very compelling and yet completely disagreeing and contradicting studies about like if everyone went vegan, for example, the earth couldn't support that. We don't have enough space to grow all those vegetables. And then I hear things like, well, the CO2 emissions from cows are doing this, chicken farms are better. So like what do you feel like would be best for the world if you were like this grand emperor and you could wave a wand?
Well, one of the things that is brought to the table in the book has to do with desert locusts being a tremendously powerful protein source. And in comparison with a lot of the meat sources that we have out there, it's about 60 to 70% by weight protein. So that particular resource, at which we will not consume, but much of the other rest of the world will, brings novel ideas to the table about food sources that we haven't even explored. Primarily because there's a yuck factor about it. Anybody eating bugs sounds like I don't think I want to do that with them. So we find ourselves pushing those things to the side. One of those things, of course, is the fact that we have, as a result, narrowed the amount of grains that we find appropriate for our diet, where there might be a lot more out there. And the desert locust, which is a protein source, not so much a vegan source or that source, is tremendously rich in being able to open up those doors. And there have been certain farms out there attempting to get the locust to, as a farm, be a resource to different communities. It's got about the same amount of protein, if not beyond that, of a shrimp, and that opportunity could open the door for a lot of other things too.
That's awesome. One more doomsday type question, and then I'm going to switch to the metaphysical side of life and kind of get into your actual philosophies about life and death and how it applies to your career and your field.
Okay.
But are we overfishing the oceans too much to that even if we stopped, we're just like screwed at this point? Like, what is going on with overfishing? You mentioned shrimp, and I have, again, I read studies that terrify me, academic studies, and then I read other studies that make me feel like nothing's the matter. So,
yeah, that's not an area where I'm an expert.
okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can put much on the table for that.
No, that's okay. I just figured if maybe in your master's programs and stuff if it came up, but I don't want to put pressure on you to talk outside of your field because that's actually a quality I deeply respect. So, yeah. Okay, so we've kind of covered sustainability. We got a little bit into like as a child what you were interested in. So I am more curious about your path to this field, but since we're talking about like some ethical issues such as telling people what they can do, how to share space, what they can and shouldn't eat, and all these other things, but we're also talking about like bees, like growing bees and farming bees, and then whether or not we farm animals specifically to eat them or to use them as tools, and all these things. So I'm kind of curious. I want to ask you the standard question of the podcast, which is what do you think happens when we die? But I'm going to add a little nuance for you. Do you think that also happens to animals and insects, which are obviously animals?
You mean the ceasing of their existence?
Well, I want to know, metaphysically speaking, what do you think is going to happen to you when you die? Like, meaning, there's a Christian popular conception. You're going to go to a place where St. Peter checks a book, and then you get in through the gates, or you're going down south to a place called hell. That's, and obviously a storybook type answer that I'm not predicting you're going to give me. But that would be one such example. So what is your philosophy? What do you actually think? And I'm not asking, like, with science behind you. Just what do you think is going to happen when you die?
Well, you have to probably go back to even the title of the book that I wrote, Man's Search for Sustainability. It parallels Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Awesome. And in his Man's Search for Meaning, of course, he says there's three reasons why those individuals in those concentration camps in World War II continued for one more day. And the first one, of course, in their motivation was that they had someone that they felt they needed to hold, to hug, to touch before this life ended. The second one is they felt within them they had either music to be sung, a painting to be painted, a book to be written. There was some motivation that was driving them to do that one more day to sustain. And the third part, which he spends a lot of his time on, has to do with that there's a bigger picture here. There's a why for the suffering that he and these other individuals in the infirmary, where he spent most of his time in these concentration camps, had to work. Why did they continue to want to live another day, knowing that everything around them wanted them dead? And because of that pressure on them to make that decision, there was a wonderful opportunity for him as a neurologist, psychologist, to see that there was something beyond. There was a why question that they hadn't answered, but they knew it was bigger than just another piece of bread for the next day, or because my heart seems to continue beating, I need to continue to push forward. All of those things kind of brought to the table his logotherapy, his understanding that the purpose in life is the answer to the question of why of this life.
And so do you think when you die, your consciousness will go on? Do you feel like you are eternal and you'll keep existing?
Yeah, I do personally believe that's the grasp that I have. I'm kind of in line with what Viktor Frankl says, that why there's got to be a story bigger than just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we will die. There's got to be something beyond that.
And do you think that animals all across the board have a similar sense of consciousness and a similar imperative, or do you think they're very different from humans?
Well, that's one of the things he brings out in the book, A Man's Search for Meaning. And I found also kind of parallel to the book on sustainability. There is an instinctual drive for their existence. And of course, there is mass extinction. I mean, you mentioned the colony collapse disorder, where it appears as if all these bees all of a sudden committed suicide. You know, they just flew off into the wild blue yonder and all died on a leaf somewhere. But there doesn't seem to be, in the overall arching of looking at these things, a grasping of a purpose beyond that instinctual drive which has been driven into their DNA. But we have that. We have something different than that.
That's very cool. Can you point to a moment in your life where you felt something that is just inexplainable, like what we're talking about?
Felt something that was inexplainable. That
Yeah, have you had a deep moment that made you really reflect that there's just something going on that's not that we're not going to understand here?
um, well, there's always the grasping of difficult situations you find yourself in. That like there's no there's no atheist in a foxhole is a way to do that. That type of situation. When I was in the military, having experiences there, there are certain times where you just say, "Is this it? Is this going to be the end?" And kind of a feeling, if it is, then that's it. But I mean, at the same time, a feeling, no, I don't think this is it. I don't think this is the closure.
That's really fascinating because I actually was just talking to my wife about that 2 days ago. That like every time I get sick, like, you know, real sick, you know how it is, like once you get over 40, getting sick isn't a huge deal, but it's a little different. Like there's a part of you that kind of is like, well, what is this going to lead to? And
Right.
and I told her, I said, there's always just this moment where I check in and I just like, nah, this isn't the one. So it's interesting because
Yeah.
I do have this weird feeling that, like, you know, they've done studies, like people get all their affairs in order and pack everything up and like for some reason hire a life insurance contract without even telling their spouse, and then they pass away like a week later from natural causes. So
Yeah.
it kind of seems like you're in that camp.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think so.
that's cool.
Yeah, I was helping a
So
friend actually just recently move some things out of a house that had been sold into a barn. Actually, his mother-in-law owned. And as we opened up the door to move these items in there, there was a headstone, her headstone, already purchased with the name, her date of birth, a dash line, and of course no date of death. And I thought, what? This is unusual. I've not seen people purchase. And he was rather frank. He says, well, there's some people that are really frugal, and my mother-in-law is one of them. She's got everything planned. So I thought, I don't think I'm going to ever buy a headstone, stick it into a barn, and just wait for the fateful day.
yeah, it's interesting. Having children, it's like I want to take care of them, but I don't want to like burden them, and so it is kind
Yeah.
of in the back of my mind. Like I've heard friends, their parents suddenly passed away, and they're in a funeral home, and the person's upselling them. You know, just like, or oh really, you're gonna get the cheapest coffin? Well, why do you offer one that's that price? You know, like what? It just, yeah, that's interesting. Let's close on something like metaphysical and kind of interesting. What is something about animals or insects that you know that you've learned about that you think humans should or could take as a gesture or something that we could like do better that they do?
Okay. Well, my book breaks up stress, work allocation, decisions, communication, and kind of contrasts the different insect populations and communities. There is the ability to make a decision that the bees have that is rather fascinating. Bees to become one hive, from one hive to become two, uh, they have to swarm. That is, the bees will leave their normal habitat of the hive. Approximately 60% plus a queen will go to a tree branch somewhere, and they'll spend about 24 to 48, maybe 72 hours there making a decision of their new home. In the period of time they're making that decision, there is a dance happening on the outside of that ball of bees where you've heard of the dance that tells them where the honey is and or where the pollen and nectar is. Well, that's actually happening on that ball of bees that's waiting to find its new home. Well, that dance is where these foragers who have now become scouts have found a new home and are coming back to make the decision. The decision of which is listened to by the rest of the bees in that group, and primarily by the queen as well, is communicated by the intensity of the dance, the length of the dance. And in that debate, they're slowly communicating and debating which one's the best. Now, over time, they're leaking information. The amount of intensity of which that dance occurs decreases. And as it decreases, the intensity of that what's being communicated decreases with it. So that eventually there's one bee out there who believes he's got the or she's got the best operation to go to that is going to convince the rest, who will then, a portion of them will go and check it out and come back. So that eventually the decision's being made. What I find something that the human population can learn from in this thing is that the leakage of information occurs without the animosity of, well, I'm sorry, you didn't choose my operation. You're just an idiot because I really do have the best home. They've been able to leak it so that the decision based upon this interaction doesn't leave people out of the picture, and usually is the best decision that they could possibly make.
Well, David Auge, thank you so much for coming on our show. It's been
Sure.
absolutely a pleasure to get to know you. You're not only smart, but you're really like personable and interesting. And I'm sure you're doing other podcasts, but I just want to let you know it's really fun to talk to. I wish I was a scientist. I wish I had the brain for engineering. I don't. I was in a fraternity in college. Every single one in it was an engineer. I was the literature major. So I'm used to hanging out with people like smarter than me. And I love it. I just love like learning from people like you. So thank you. There will be a note for how to find your book, but is there anything else you'd like to talk about before you leave? Is there any message you have for our audience?
Well, perhaps just understand that what I'm doing is looking at observation, looking at the bees, looking at the desert locust, doing the best I can to analyze it and then apply it. And if you can get that concept and those 3 steps from what I've written and tried to communicate, I think we can all grow from it. We can all gain something from this.
That is awesome. And thank you so much again for coming on the show. To everyone at home, please do check out the notes and please check out his book. Once again, you have been watching or listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living. My name is Mike Oppenheim, and we will see you soon. Walked in a line.